It's been a very odd week at the Lords, starting with the Queen's speech, which I wasn't nominated to attend, so you didn't see me in ermine. There was a lot of ceremony, but obviously with a lot fewer people than usual, a lot less people even. And it was one of those atmospheres when I arrived in of loads and loads of lords and ladies who I've never seen before because they were in for the ceremony. And there was one very odd occasion where they were all looking at me like, who's she? Whereas I was looking at them thinking, who are they? Obviously, they've been there decades. I've only just arrived, but they haven't been in physically. So in a good sense, it looks like we're going to go back to normal. But there was one funny incident where everyone was queuing up, and I thought they were queuing up to go in the chamber, which I was also not able to get a seat for the opening debate. So I queued up for 20 minutes in a queue, a long, long queue. And when I got to the doorkeeper, they said, we already know you're here. I said, I know, I'm queuing up to be allowed to go in. They said, oh no, they're queuing up to get their tick for their money. I thought it was all a bit unsavoury myself. Anyway, so there you go. One of those stories from the Lords. So all this new legislation's coming through from the Queen's speech. And what I really wanted to reflect on is, to my horror, I've discovered that when you actually look at the legislation closely, it bears no relationship to the popular discussion on it. And I think that that is one thing that I've learned very rapidly, and it's a bit frightening. I've just been listening to Woman's Hour, and on Woman's Hour they were talking about the online harms bill, and they had people on who have suffered really gross trolling. And they were talking about how horrible it is, particularly for women, of course, to be on the receiving end of that. And don't I know it? And a shout out to Ali on Twitter, who's just spent the last few days being trolled viciously because she dared to challenge some of the race baiting that happens on Twitter. And it's so horrible and frustrating. So you think, online harms bill, this will solve everything. And they had this conversation about the bill as though it was aimed at protecting people from nasty comments on social media. When you actually look at the bill, and it's a very thick bill, I've just picked up, the equivalent of bricks of words that I have to go through. You realise that this is one of the greatest acts of censorship that this country will have ever known. That the online harms bill, which again is popularly understood to protect children from abuse or from some of the grosser things that you're going to see on social media, is actually going to give an enormous amount of power both to Ofcom as a government regulator and to the social media companies who will be charged with the duty of care to ensure that we do not hear things which are lawful but offensive or in somebody's eyes hateful or indeed misinformation as decided by Ofcom or the social media companies. It's genuinely a scary draconian bill, but it's not presented like that at all. A bit closer to home is the Academic Freedom Bill. Of course, I'm excited that the government have had the courage to, dip their toe in and say they're going to fight for free speech on campus. I've been talking about this for decades, so it's great to kind of finally get recognition. And then you read the bill, and then you think, oh my God, they are going to get themselves into such a mess. Now, I'm generally supportive of this bill, although I think that if you're going to protect free speech on campus, then having a bill like the online safety bill that's going to damage you off campus or online is a bit contradictory. But even still, the Academic Freedom Bill has got a lot of pitfalls in it. It's very narrow in its definition of what you should be allowed to say, and almost by making it law about what you're going to be allowed to have academic freedom from, it actually ring fences off a whole range of things that it will be perfectly acceptable to silence on campus, let alone the limitations of using threats and fines in order to enforce free speech. That should be the only thing I'm worried about, but there's a lot more to worry about. And then there's another bill. These are the three that I'm going to particularly be interested in, which is the Skills Bill. Now, this again is one which I welcome. It's an attempt to say that the 50% of young people who don't go to university should not be neglected. As a further education lecturer from the past, I welcome its nod to the FE sector and the skills for life stuff. I think people should be able to get qualifications whenever they want, so that's all good. But it misses a really big point. it misses an important point, which is that most of the snobbish elitism aimed at those who don't go to university happens culturally. We only have to remember the Brexit vote when everybody kept stressing that everybody who voted Leave wasn't educated. That kind of disdain can't just be solved by the technical means of legislation. If you've already adopted the idea that the people who have most wisdom and who are most able to deal with democracy are those with PhDs or degrees and have treated anyone who hasn't got qualifications as though they're second order, well, you can see that there's a greater problem than this bill will address. But it's more than that. I think there's a danger, and I listened in yesterday to the debates on the bill that effectively said that there are types of people who aren't academic. Well, that fills me with horror as well, because let me tell you, there's no type of person who isn't entitled to an academic education until they're 16. And even if they go on to be plumbers or builders or work on the railways, that doesn't mean that they should not be entitled to and given as wide an appreciation of Shakespeare, historical facts and analysis, shouldn't be entitled to understand about physics and so on. So I can just see that even though, again, it's a bill that I want to support, there's a lot more going on there that I'm going to have to keep my eye on. So where that leaves me is with a very busy period ahead. This is the first time that I've been at the beginning of the Lords when it's a new parliamentary period, and although there's 6 weeks off in the summer, which is ludicrously long, I appreciate, they're going to try and cram in as many of these bills as possible before that and then afterwards. So I'm going to have a lot of reading and thinking to do. But the main thing is that it shouldn't be resolved in the Lords. You know, it shouldn't be just like that there's people who are going to read these bills and scrutinise them. What we need are popular campaigns against some of the legislation that's going through. And the only way that can happen is if the media reads the bills instead of reading the memes or reading the press releases, actually gets to the nitty-gritty of what's going on. The fire safety bill, finally, was a good example of that. How can anyone possibly object to a fire safety bill, which is the thing which I talked endlessly about at the end of the last session. But the fire safety bill had a clause in it which will mean that leaseholders are forced to pay the remediation costs for all fire safety defects. And when I say all, huge amounts. Some people are facing bills of tens of thousands of pounds, as I spoke about a great deal. But it's just that on paper, it sounds like it's a fire safety bill, and what can you object to? So I would urge my colleagues in the media to go a little bit beyond the scrutinising of a press release. Read the legislation and make sure that you are part of holding it to account. And I say to you, the public, all of this legislation is available. It's available on government websites. I'll put it on my website and you can see it. You should read it. You should scrutinise it. One of the great things about Brexit for me was every time the government came out with some silly plan, those parts of the government that were trying to scupper Brexit, they'd say, oh, it's all right, we've done a deal, the May deal. You don't have to worry about it, the Chequers deal. What you got was all these leaver groups who'd go to source, read it and debunk it and pass it. That's what everybody needs to do. That's the tradition that we should have. If we're going to take back control, you have to know what you're taking control of. So you've got a lot of work to do as well as me.